Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we're going to be talking about coaching and coaches' experiences of vulnerability and uncertainty, and we're going to be doing that with Dr Charlie Corsby, Dr Andy Lane, and Professor Robyn Jones. Gentlemen, welcome.
Hi Dan, thanks very much for having us.
Thank you, Dan.
Hi there.
It's great to have you all on. This is going to be an exciting conversation. We're going to unpack a paper or a number of papers you've done on this subject over the past few years. But let's start where we always start on the Sports Psych Show. Let's do some introductions here. Charlie, if we come to you first, tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about your work.
Yeah, hi Dan. So as you say, Charlie Corsby. I am a senior lecturer in sport coaching at Cardiff Met University. More generally, I'm kind of interested in all sports, but my kind of sporting background and coaching background lies within football, perhaps more specifically within semi-professional football as well. Probably worth clarifying. And then I have a UEFA A licence. I currently work with the university football side as well at Cardiff Met, so practicing coach as well, and all my research has to date been kind of located within sport coaching, particularly in terms of social relational matters, and I have some kind of specific theoretical trends I guess you could describe that mark my work, but perhaps we'll go into that later.
Got to ask the question, Charlie. The psychological side of football as a semi-professional footballer, strength or an area that when you reflect back, could have gone better for you?
I would describe it as ambivalent. Yeah, I think. Inevitably there's some features that I look back and I was really happy. I'm really happy with how I was able to cope with certain situations, and then inevitably you look back and there's some things that I could have been a little bit stronger at, which I think is somewhat reflected in my work as well. Yeah, how I've come to see kind of the related disciplines, not trying to be too tight with some of those boundaries, and I think that probably comes from some of my playing experiences, just how I've transitioned to coaching and the practice of that as well.
Well, it's great to have you on, Charlie, and you were lead author of the paper that the main paper we're going to unpack. So really looking forward to that. And moving on here, Dr. Andrew Lane. Andy, great to see you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Yeah, thanks Dan. So just not to confuse things, I'm not the other Professor Andrew Lane. My name is Sake, who obviously works in the field of sports psychology as well.
Yes.
My background generally in coaching started actually within football. Don't have the dizzy heights of an A license, I have a C license, and sort of coached children, community settings, a couple of clubs in their academies. I think it was the Development Centre and Academy of Centre of Excellence at that period of time. And then sort of transitioned actually into triathlon. So I worked in football for about 10 years, and then since 2003, again, coaching children. And then probably from about 2009 onwards, started working with people at sort of an international level. The last sort of 3 Commonwealth Games, World Triathlon Series, sort of European champs and things like that. So I moved across really from football to triathlon. And similarly, I started my academia in sports psychology and then have transitioned into coaching really.
And so, like your namesake, the other Andrew Lane, Professor Andrew Lane from the University of Wolverhampton, who's actually been on the show a few times. You're a triathlete, because I know the other Andrew Lane is stunningly fit. I mean, he just exhausts me when he tells me about his physical feats and what he does every single day to keep himself fit. Psychology of triathlon, is that something that's very prevalent in your life, Andy?
I wouldn't describe myself as a triathlete, that's for sure. I still probably see myself as someone who just kicked a football around the pitch and did a bit of running and cycling and swimming at some point. My partner, she's a professional triathlete. So, in sort of our household daily conversations around things and managing that. So, I think it features in a lot of my work, obviously coaching.
Fantastic. And coming over to you, Professor Robyn Jones, fantastic to have you on. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Sure, Dan. Yes, thanks for having me on the show, of course, yes, and the other two. I guess the first thing I've got to say is that I'm definitively not a sports psychologist, which
Yes.
Which brings to the question about why the hell would you invite someone like myself on the show? But I also want to say something about the other Andrew Lane, actually, because the both of us actually started as early academics at West London Institute of Higher Ed in London. where he registered as a PhD student, and it was my first job as a lecturer. So I've actually kind of followed, really kind of from afar, Andy's rise in the ranks of, like a sports psychologist in academia in particular. So, but yes, why would you have me on the show? Because I'm not particularly, as I said, like a sports psychologist. Coaching is my area of interest, my area of research. Why did I start that? Just to stay close to football when I finished, really. But I was much more perhaps interested, not in the psychological, but in the interactive nature of coaching, about what was going on here. I didn't really see it as something that was happening inside my head, or or the head of the athletes as such, but something that happened in between us, within the environment. And that kind of followed a line into looking at interaction, which led to the work of Irving Goffman, really, who can be described and described himself as a social psych, although he refused, any sort of label. But so I've been in HE for 30 years now. A coach for 40 till about 5 years ago, when I finally said it, like, enough's enough, which goes to some of the vulnerability stuff, actually. But yes, in short, that's me.
Well, I think everything you said there is fascinating, because as a sports psychologist, I'm not sure that psychology is just from the neck upwards. I always find it diverse and broad, and it's, as you've mentioned there, and perhaps you define it slightly differently, more, as you say, in the realm of social psychology or sociality, which is it's the in between, isn't it? It's the interactions between people on the pitch, on the court, on the course, in the clubhouse, if you like, that counts so much. So I don't know. Maybe as a sports psychologist, I just take a broad brush definition and approach to psychology, and see the in between is very relevant for my work, Robyn. I really, really do.
Thank you.
And we're here today to talk about a paper that the three of you have co-written. Charlie, you led this paper. It's entitled Contending with Vulnerability and Uncertainty: What Coaches Say About Coaching. Absolutely fascinating to me, as somebody who is at the coalface, working every single day with coaches and experiencing some of the things that you speak to in this paper. I mean, Charlie, coming to you first, you led on this paper. We're going back a couple of years, but not too long ago, a couple of years. Tell us a little bit about the beginnings of this paper.
Yeah, of course. So the paper emanated out of a wider project with UEFA. So we were fortunate enough to get one of the UEFA research grants that UEFA kindly back. We tried a couple of times, and we finally got some success back in 2019, I think it was. So this was part of their kind of research program, and it was a wider project around really trying to understand the everyday struggles, the challenges, what vexes coaches, where do they get joy from as well, and just really trying to shed light onto that kind of day-to-day practice of what it's like to be a professional coach. So we really targeted it at professional coaches, looking at it as their profession, and a real kind of more broad general sense around what it's like to be a coach as well, trying to address some of those questions in the objectives of that wider project. So completed the project, delivered for UEFA, and then inevitably, as part of the write-up and the dissemination, this is where this paper came from. And so this is the first of a series of papers that we've got coming out of that particular data set. And it really kind of tries to capture, in some sense, like a kind of an ironic way, like what did coaches actually say about what they did when they were doing coaching. And so in that regard, we interviewed a series of coaches, all professional. They were A license or above, working in full-time professional football. And so the data in many senses was, how do the coaches speak about their coaching practice? And that's really where kind of some of the data led, so the project led more generally, and really trying to capture how it is that the coaches were talking about their practice. And the analysis consequently was kind of a result of the discussions that we had as a group, the experience that we had actually interviewing the coaches. I think that's probably one of the things that we'll kind of stress throughout the conversation that we go here, how unique that we we feel like the way that we've tried to capture some of the experiences of the coaches by taking what they say as a reflection, as standing on behalf of coaching practice, and really trying to shed light onto what that looks like. So yeah, I'd say that was kind of the general overview. It's a paper that comes from a wider project, and we've tried to capture some of those specifics as well.
What I'm hearing there is an interview with professional coaches, so it's at the professional level, and having a conversation around their experiences of their coaching practice. Andy, an area of real fascination for you. This is certainly something that really, really interests me. What do people say about their own profession? What experiences do they have? How do those experiences impact them? Andy, what was your involvement and interest here?
Yeah, I guess, again, the interest is trying to get to the everydayness of coaches' practice, is trying to understand that. Certainly, I think some other research that tends to look at these things often might come from a model perspective or a different perspective. So we really wanted to get to grips with what happens, what they say about their coaching practice every day. And again, that's something important to identify through the method, right? This is about what they have said they do or what is going on. So we can ever probably really claim with interviews. And then, my specific involvement, like Charlie mentioned, it comes from a wider project that probably used surveys with, I think we had sort of 370 odd coaches initially that we whittled down to about 260 by the time we sort of removed S&C coaches and things. And then for this project, we specifically then used the data from about 20 interviews with professional coaches, predominantly across the men's game. It was across Europe. We have a couple of coaches working the women's game and a couple of female coaches specifically. But that was, again, quite interesting just in terms of when we were trying to recruit participants. It was actually difficult to access certain places. The women's game was particularly difficult to actually get into contact with. I imagine most of those coaches are asked a lot to get involved in projects, so it's probably quite tiring and demanding for them. So, yeah, in terms of involvement, it's quite wide from recruitment to conducting data to obviously then analysing it and writing it.
And coming to you, Robyn, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here because I know in the discussion of this paper, you spoke quite a bit to the interaction piece between coaches and the importance of that. But I'm sure setting out on this kind of research project from your lens of the world, because in your introduction you talked about unsure necessarily about the psychological elements of this, but the social elements of this, that coaches have perhaps been socialized into a position of vulnerability, of loneliness, of being alone, of I've just got to work hard as a coach. Coming into this piece of research, Robyn, what was your thoughts and feelings about how this was going to go? What kind of results that you might see? What kind of conversations that might be had?
Just to add on there, Dan, we came from our experiences, as you've heard as well.
Yeah.
We have an epistemology, which is the nature of knowledge question. But nothing happens in a social vacuum. There's always some kind of run-in. There's a history, a context to it. So we had our experiences and some of the work that we've done over the past 20, 30 years, about the kind of, the actual kind of sociality of the thing, as you said. So we knew coaches, to greater or lesser extents, feel a lot of stress and pressure and vulnerability and insecurity. We sort of implicitly and explicitly recognize this. So it was an attempt to actually unearth kind of some of this in terms of how they managed the vulnerability. Because we felt it as coaches. It's one of these things, one of the old adages like in football. When you win in football, it's such a high, it's such a buzz, and I'm sure it's the same in most of the sports. Unfortunately, that high probably lasts about 45 minutes at best, and then you start to worry about the next game. But the losses on the other side, the losses will last with you all week, and you can't wait for the next outing. You just cannot wait to try to put things right. So really, we knew this kind of feeling, like implicitly, and we'd had strong hints in other research. So it was to better understand this and how individuals just manage these feelings, how they justify them, into themselves and others, and how they worked really with those thoughts and justifications in mind. How they lived with themselves, really.
As you were speaking, I was thinking of a conversation I had with Dr. Martin Turner on the Sports Psych show. He suggested that certainly in adult elite sport, the professional level, and possibly across sport, the experiences we have around our relationship with outcomes tend to be when we lose, we're devastated. When we win, we're simply relieved. So winning doesn't, the emotion of winning doesn't necessarily mirror the extreme of the emotion of losing.
Yes, relief is a good word for it, actually. But I do think that there's something more than just relief. It's an enormous relief.
Yes, it's a
It's
release.
which it's an emotional release. Yes, I remember. Somehow I used to try to force myself, to actually enjoy this a bit more. So I used to sit in the dressing room for about 45 minutes afterwards, just to somehow, like absorb the atmosphere and kind of sense the joy and the happiness, within the dressing room, after a win, and then you go out and start to then analyze the game, of course, and then you analyze it in relation to what happened in the game, but also you think about, okay, well, what can we do on Monday night then to actually improve on this, and what can we do on that to, what can I say to him or her to actually lift them up or to drag them down a little bit, and of course, you do have to speak a lot with those who didn't play, because you cannot lose the ones who didn't play. So it's not about the performance very often. It's about the interaction then that generates something of a oneness, to go forward, together.
And listening to what you're saying there, Robyn, it's making me think of, and we will unpack some of the findings from the interviews that you had in a few minutes, but it's making me think of the onerous nature of coaching. That, for you saying there post game, I sat there for 45 minutes taking it in and maybe enjoying the atmosphere if you won, but then you're thinking about, okay, how do I deal with it? How do I deal with the players that didn't play, and how am I going to, then what about next week, and then what about the next few weeks? And so it's a never ending loop of thinking and feeling and experience that you kind of get tied to, which reading through this work tended to be, if I was to summarize it, summarize the experiences that these people you interviewed had, these coaches, it's this never-ending loop of being constantly involved, or feeling like they had to. I mean, no question there, but that's kind of the overall impression I had from, the nature of what it is to be a coach.
Yeah, I think if I can add on to that as well, Dan, it really speaks to the experience that we had going through the project. So you asked a question earlier around maybe some of the assumptions that we had, and Robyn's, as he excellently explained, is the tensions, some of the feelings, the exaggerations that you have through winning and losing, and we were expecting to perhaps unveil a little bit more of that, and actually what we really ended up finding was the ways that the coaches were actually talking about this. They found it difficult to talk about, difficult to express, and so in their expressions, they were expressing the very tension that we're referring to. That they would go from, it's really difficult, but I love working really hard, and in each of the statements, they were almost like they had the tension of either end of what we're referring to, and it wasn't just that it was this overly negative thing either. I think that's also worth stressing, that there was some kind of referrals to being really grateful for the position and hence the need to work so hard, which was kind of again one of the kind of relationalities that we were trying to unveil within this particular paper and the wider project as well. And I think it speaks to Robyn and several others kind of research profiles as what they've tried to do within coaching studies.
Well, perhaps, Charlie, just staying with you here and starting to think about unpacking some of these findings, so perhaps looking at this in more granular detail. To repeat ourselves here, basically this research project was interviewing professional coaches and finding out about their experiences of the all-encompassing nature of coaching, especially around unpacking that idea of vulnerability in an uncertain environment. So can we start to unpack some of these findings, please, Charlie?
Yeah, of course. I think before I talk to maybe some of the findings, it would be worth just bringing in this idea of an official line. So we take it from the work of Harold Garfinkel. But the idea is the official line was how individuals explain something there's a like normative way of explaining something. So it tells you something about the activity that you're talking about. So there's kind of set ways of talking about things. And so we kind of take that principle in towards the findings. So it's quite important to preface that first, because essentially we then have three kind of areas or findings that we then present in the paper. The first one is around the manifestation of hard work. The second one is doing things the right way. And then the third one is unveiling vulnerability. So taken as a three, the first two really speak to kind of this official line that when we were speaking to the coaches, it was almost quite difficult. I got this sense as a researcher that there was a way in which the participants, these professional coaches, had to speak about their profession. And so in that sense, the first one was like this manifestation of hard work. Yeah, they have to say that they're working hard. So everything was going around this sense of like needing to feel busy. The job never leaving them. And so we're trying to present that in the first section, like this constant like narrative around, right, well, I work hard. I'm the hardest working person in the room. And so we're really trying to kind of outlay that in the first finding, which very much relates to the second point as well around doing things the right way. So in addition to this sense of working hard, the coaches were trying to demonstrate, and this is general, I'm kind of generalizing as well, but the coaches were trying to talk about that in working hard, there was a right way to work hard, and the right way is what they knew. And they were very self-contained, self-purposeful, self-possessed in the sense that they knew what the right way was, so they could provide directions. Which, when I say around it standing on behalf of something, the need to work hard and the need to know what you're working hard at was something that they had to demonstrate, because of what they're talking about is very uncertain. They couldn't at any point guarantee a particular set of results. You can't guarantee that you're going to get an outcome on the weekend when you're playing particular opposition. You don't necessarily know what you're doing. You're trying your best to know, but you don't know. And this is where the uncertainty comes from. The performance is always uncertain, but yet the narrative that they were then portraying often was a sense of kind of certainty. And this is what we're talking about when we have the tension between how the coaches were talking about their practice and then what the practice was standing on behalf of, i.e. uncertainty in their set of results. So the first two findings really kind of lay that tension out. And then the third part then is kind of a little bit when some of those kind of illustrative narratives start to slip away and they actually start to talk around, well, this is perhaps some of the realities. When you finish the game, you're feeling really drained, feeling exhausted, waking up the next day feeling absolutely shattered, but having to work with players who didn't get the game time, that they still need the physical output, and you've got to kind of get yourself back up again and put that performance on. The personal investment needed, because often coaches are traveling all around the country. It's a relentless schedule. It requires an immense amount of sacrifice as well. And so again, these kind of like little snippets of vulnerability were coming out, juxtaposed against the first two findings, which was this sense of certainty. I know I'm going to work hard and I know what I'm going to work hard at. But then we've also got this kind of sense of uncertainty, vulnerability associated with it. So that's kind of like the overview of the findings, I would say.
It's a really interesting narrative. I mean, maybe coming to you, Andy, as you were listening in there and thinking about these findings. I mean, what I'm hearing from Charlie there is coaches, their narrative of their profession, their narrative of their landscape. I must work hard because that's what we do. There is a right way to do this, as in what I'm doing, and I have to. I almost heard, and gents, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I almost heard I have to be perceived to know what I'm doing, to be correct, and that's my way and it's the right way, I can't demonstrate any kind of uncertainty whatsoever. And as Charlie said, juxtaposed against this position of, I have to take this exhaustive approach, and it is an everyday thing, but by Jove, it is quite exhausting. But I've got to do it, though. It is really exhausting, and I'm kind of tired. So there's this kind of mixed narrative here. I mean, no question, Andy, but when you read this paper back and you listen to Charlie and you think about these narratives, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, of course, the initial question might be, for lots of people listening in, especially a new coach, why on earth would I coach them?
Yes.
Given this backdrop to it, why would I be involved? And I think that's something Charlie mentioned at the start. The important thing is here, the coaches didn't necessarily claim that this was a problem. They didn't necessarily claim that it was debilitating in any way. We also obviously explored through the project emotions tied to joy, etc. So just coming back to the start is making sure that we emphasize that these findings are interrelated. So whilst in the paper you put them under different subheadings, if you like, sub-themes, however you want to claim them, you've got to talk about them together. So as Charlie's kind of alluded to there, the fact that the backdrop is this uncertainty, the precarious nature of, well, job security, short-term contracts. You're never that many games away from being sacked, essentially, or people having an opinion on you. So there's that sort of backdrop to it. So then, of course, working the right way was often, as Charlie mentioned, the hard way, being first in and last out at night. And these are some of then the unwritten rules that we're trying to take issue with, probably, and certainly thinking forward for coaches is trying to make them aware of what tone are perhaps they setting for other coaches in those spaces, particularly when they're perhaps more senior or managerial. You know, if this is the way that coaching is currently be, does this have to be the way that coaching can be? And that probably then speaks to some of the other papers that are coming out of this. Certainly trying to think, well, how do we move things forward? But of course, football is such a giant in terms of it's a business, multi-million pound, £billion, and more. Lots of different stakeholders. There's lots of pressures associated with it. The media involved. There's so many stakeholders. The men's games, the women's games, sponsorship, etc. So, you know, we're not trying to suggest that we can change things quickly and radically here. But certainly when we think about the coaches that were involved in this group, you can probably start to think, okay, we need to help them understand this uncertainty, the precariousness. We can see through the people striving then for technical competence, as I think you mentioned, the belief in, well, if I do it this way, this is my way, and hopefully then I'll be okay with that. Should I be sacked, I can live with that, knowing that I've given it my all. And so again, these are the types of things that we just hope that coaches are trying to be aware of, and maybe we can help them with some of the resources to cope in that sort of uncertain environment.
And I'd love to come on to talk about that, but before we do, coming to you, Robyn, having listened into Charlie and Andy and knowing the paper as you do, I'd love to get your thoughts on the findings here, if possible.
Sure. Just echoing and expanding on really what the both have already said. I think what we found here was a coaching performance that gave them a security that the job didn't allow them to have. So they claimed the busyness of the job, the first in, last out that Andy was referring to, being the hardest worker in the room. Language and discourse like I wouldn't ask anyone just to do anything I wouldn't do myself. All these things emerged, which was a performance of security more than anything else. But this wasn't insincere, like in any way. It was just that there's so much ambiguity and uncertainty involved, maybe kind of surrounding them, with the job itself, a context of work settings itself, that this was how they counterbalanced that to a certain degree. And so some of the language was about, you have to be honest with players. You have to be honest with them all the time. But this wasn't a call for, some kind of a moral stance. It was a call to, okay, well, I'm in charge and I need to say these things. So, the fallacy, of course, is when they say that you have to be honest with people. Well, that's probably not very good for social relations in the short or the long run. And yet, it's the most kind of social of jobs, and yet one of the most loneliness of jobs. because what they became was their own kind of point of reference. And so they usually had others around them, which were supportive, but often they heard their own voice. So the staff were almost like an echo chamber, really, of themselves, because they appointed them, again, for good reasons, really, of security. Because what you don't want to do is to go into work every day and be challenged every single day. You just can't function like that. And so they needed that security, but of course they became their only kind of point of reference. And so we had this kind of narrative of assertiveness, of kind of self-reliance, of kind of strength, of self-justification. So they were very, very much individuals in the job, but they weren't supported to be individuals. So they were very, very, yes, vulnerable, like as such.
I don't think I'm going to formulate a question now, but I'll just make a few statements. Listening to the three of you reading through the paper and thinking about this, with relation to my experiences at the coalface, and thinking about why these coaches are experiencing what they're experiencing. It might just be that is the nature of coaching. But I just wonder if coaches experience what they do now at the professional level. We're talking about the professional level. It's nested in the socio-historical context of coaching. A head coach, this is about me. This is about my knowledge. I'm the head coach. I've got to impart this knowledge. I've got to work harder than everybody else. It strikes me that you are immersed in that environment from a socio-historical context. It also makes me think, and this is, I think, borrowed from my experiences at the coalface, I think of the macro structures within these organizations, the policies, the processes, the practices that they deem to be acceptable based on that social landscape of, we win, we lose, and then that's what it's all about. And perhaps the lack of sophistication within those macro structures that doesn't guard against the feelings of vulnerability with relation to winning, losing, and keeping my job, or I'm losing my job based on those. So no question, but as you were speaking, it was making me think of those things, and that I suppose what I'm saying is a coach, an individual coach, isn't necessarily to blame, because this is how a coach has been socialized into coaching. And when one steps into a professional organization, respectfully, more often than not, the macro structures aren't sophisticated enough to protect that individual from the overt nature of failure. No question. Just a thought.
Said like a sociologist.
I'm thinking of swapping from psychology to sociology. How about that?
The sports sociologist show.
Yes.
Yeah. I think I can try and extend some of what you said there.
Thank you.
I really like the way you've tried to link that into context, and I think that's kind of a message that we want to pull out of the paper, and it's not to kind of create these either or dichotomies in the way that we're going to talk about coaching. I.e., although we have in some senses implicitly and explicitly critiqued this kind of self-determined portrayal of the way the coaches were talking about their coaching practice, it's also not a case of, well, we can now go to organizations and say, run these series of workshops, put these things in place, and you will then solve some of the ills of this kind of self-determined portrayal. It's not an either or, and it's not a criticism of those who are expressing these narratives, or these official lines, as we call it in the paper. But it's really trying to pull out and perhaps make more explicit what this kind of, we call it an attitude of an I, does, the consequences of this, and how it can lead to failing to understand your position in relation to others, coach's position in relation to others, or how others might be shaping your identity, or how you might be influencing and being influenced by communities and the context in which you're working. And so that can consequently lead to this kind of lack of support for individuals. But it's really trying to make some explicit statements about how these kind of narratives, how this official line shapes and is shaping practice, and to try and make that explicit so that individuals can be more sensitive towards their context, so they can be more aware, more clear in the way that they are relationally bound to the people that they're working with.
If I can just add in there, Dan, as well, so part of the destructiveness here is that they were very, very aware of the cost of this attitude, of this lifestyle, going up and down the country. The cost of families was immense, like on themselves as well, like as well as wives and families. But they also justified it in relation to it's worth it. Yeah, I wouldn't have it any other way. And we were kind of reasonably sure they didn't really mean that in a kind of throwaway light sense. But it was just what they perceived that the job actually required of them. And they couldn't see another way of doing the job. And so these are kind of some of the social features, these kind of social, almost invisible rings that can surround events. But it's not to say that you have to obey these. You don't have to. So there's a sense of agency. Wasn't very apparent in our work here, but there's always a sense of agency that the odd one used to say, well, I suppose I don't have to do this. I don't have to be in the office at 6:30 because the analyst can do that. So there was a recognition of, but the enactment, the expectation was just overriding everything, from what we saw.
And as you're both speaking, but as you're speaking there, Robyn, I'm thinking about, you speak of agency. Is this a knowledge problem? Is this a challenge for coaches to understand what it actually exists? That actually the ability to broaden one's definition of leadership, leading a team, requires effective leadership is the ability to bring other people in and use their skill set, for example. And that too often, again, socialized into, well, I'm the head coach and my identity is that I have to be all-knowing and all-seeing, otherwise I'm going to, the meaning around that narrative could be I'm going to lose the changing room. But actually, as you mentioned there, Robyn, I can pass this on to somebody else, and actually those people within their immediate environment want that responsibility to be passed on to them. I know as a sports psychologist, I yearn for head coaches to pass on responsibility to me for mental skills, because I think too many head coaches think that they do it and actually don't necessarily do a great job of it all the time, because it's not necessarily within the sphere of their immediate skill set, although some are great psychologists within their role as a coach. Is this almost like an ontological problem? An understanding of what exists out there in the world. And so if I understand that a broader sense of leadership is possible, a flattening of the hierarchy, a lessening of might lessen my autonomy slightly, but I'm going to bring others in to do a job that helps me do my job. Again, no question, but just a thought.
I mean, some of the difficulty, something really that we've already written about, actually, like in response,
okay, is
that it's obviously very, very difficult for an individual to change an organization. It's like turning around, like an oil tanker. It takes forever, to do a U-turn in it.
Yeah.
But it's not to say that you're not able to influence your environment, and when that environment is somewhat altered, then something else becomes altered. Now, there's no kind of straight line here, linear line, and I don't want to over-egg the agency, but we can alter things, but it's really unrealistic for us to expect any real change, like unless there is at an organization level, because your coaches, especially at the level that we researched, they live and die on the consequences of their results on Saturdays or Wednesdays or whatever. So if the results aren't good, they probably are in danger, like, of losing their jobs. And what can they do about that in the immediacy? Probably not a lot. But they can do some things, and we elaborate on exactly what they can do, and to reconceptualize their role a little bit, to always think of a long game. Even though the short game is imperative, you've always got to have something of a long game. It's not one or the other, it's always the both, but what do you have your emphasis on at the moment? So there are ways an individual can change organizations, but not to be naive that they can do it kind of straight away, that it's straightforward, that it's linear, that it's easy. It is definitively not easy, and hence their vulnerability.
I think if I can extend on that as well, one of the things that we've spoke frequently throughout the project and when we were talking about the data was really trying to get to grips on what are we even talking about when we're talking about coaching, right? What is the essence of coaching? What is essential to coaching practice? And when we start to talk about it, inevitably we talk about others, we talk about relations, we talk about having influence, which speaks to what Robyn was just mentioning around the kind of managing the short term and the long term. Where can I get influence right now? Where can I get influence in a set amount of time in the future? How can I preserve some of that influence, which is inevitably influence over others? And thinking about learning as well, and how you're influencing learning and development within your organization, and specifically with the players who are going to be the ones that are going out onto the field, and trying to get to grips as to what is actually essential to coaching, what is the essence of coaching, then helps actually get you to think about what are the consequences of what I'm doing and how I'm talking about my practice. And this is again this kind of juxtaposition between the self-determined portrayal, the work hard, the kind of the greediness in some of that, and then the greediness of an institution in terms of wanting more, wanting results, wanting to be bigger, better, next qualification, next league each year, and then thinking about how that has a subsequent influence on the people who are doing that job. And I think there was probably there's some work there when you're talking, Dan, around like the consequences of the work in terms of thinking about, well, what are we actually talking about when we talk about coaching, and then how does that subsequently link to how we talk about coaching, and then how we might do coaching, what it's then standing on behalf of.
And for me, this comes full circle back to what we described earlier about doing it the right way or their way, and that's not in any way to suggest that these coaches were bullish and it's like, well, my way is the only way. That's not what we were trying to portray by that point. But as Robyn highlighted when he said, well, it's their results, well, there is quite often understandably assumed to be the coach's responsibility. So of course, then they feel this sense of pressure to have to work hard, to do more. Maybe I won, maybe I lost, maybe I drew at the weekend, but I can do more to hopefully then get the next result. And right at the start of the conversation, we spoke about just moving forward. I think Robyn mentioned sitting in the change room for 45 minutes. Well, after victory, you move on pretty quickly. After the other types of results, you probably stay there for longer. And again, then coming back, coaches get absorbed by that and they almost relegate others. And I think we spoke about that in sort of the second finding, that they just shift the focus away from their family life, even themselves. And it's all about, well, the players, the team, the next game.
And just your follow-up, Andy's just going to spark something in me here. That really what we found, that these individuals were individuals by default. There was a culture like of individualism here, but they weren't supported, to be individual. And this was the ironic thing, that they were very, very vulnerable, like individuals. But this is how they justified themselves as well. So they weren't without responsibility here in recreating this, although largely that I'm not sure that they knew of any other way. And so this was quite interesting for us as well. And so we had these, heroic individual stories. As long as I do it my way, I'm okay. Yes, I'm okay with the sack as long as I do it my way. Well, have you checked, with your family, about this, or it was expressions of what on the surface appears quite kind of selfishness, but they were really, in lots of ways, it was the opposite, Dan. It was the opposite. It was very kind of sacrificial that we felt. It was just a story that they told themselves in order to actually live and thrive and survive in this insecurity.
It's about me. I have to be outstanding. I have to make sacrifices.
Yes, which is where we take some issue, with And I'm a big believer, all of us are big believers in agency here, that we should be doing what we're able to. But this is where we take some issue with kind of self-determination. That, really, unless we are aware of and somewhat kind of factor in what we're able to do with what we have at the time, then we tend to waste an enormous amount of energy trying to self-justify. A major example of this, like in a way, is using stats and performance analysis. I actually kind of swallow that stuff whole. I absolutely love it. But I also know that the way that it's often used is to justify decisions. Look, I told you that this is what happened. So again, it's a cult of the individual. It's the cult of the isolationist, the only point of reference, because they can't afford to do anything else, for their own sense of selves.
Staying with this theme of self, within coaching, of self as hero, self as star.
Yes.
This is something that over the years, 18 years now as a sports psychologist at the coalface, I've learned. Because I think as a sports psychologist, you do actually start very much with the individual in mind. But what you learn through all of your experiences is the power of network across the organization and how that is underutilized, possibly because when I come back to socio-historical context and perhaps insufficient macro structures of how an understanding of how high performance is done. If we look at modern day sport, we're going to get, if we're talking about football here specifically and using the language of football soccer, we've got to get this star manager or star head coach in, because that star manager or head coach is going to solve our problems. But there's absolutely no way it cannot be disputed that some people in their profession are better than other people in their profession. It's indisputable that ultimately you look at the landscape right now, Pep Guardiola is clearly a very good head coach and manager. Jurgen Klopp is clearly a very good head coach and manager. Emma Hayes, Serena Wiegmann, absolutely brilliant at what they do. But if we're talking about those in particular, they're embedded in cultures that are probably more holistic in nature, whilst power is enjoyed and maintained, the power-threat relationship is lowered a little bit, and probably there is more cohesion across coaches. If we're talking about those examples in particular, that there are coaches who are better at coaching without a shadow of a doubt, but the best coaches are ones who are using their network more effectively. Perhaps to bring us back to the point.
Pep Guardiola, I think, is a fascinating example. In lots of ways, I think he's a visionary. Like, he's advanced in the football. Building on Cruyff, who in turn built on Rinus Michels, but you can see the power structures that actually run through his sides. He's a choreographer. He sells kind of star players who don't quite sort of follow his way of doing things. Excellent players. So there's very little room for, I wouldn't call it dissent. I wouldn't call it like anti-individualism, but you do have to fit a particular jigsaw with him. That if you don't, then actually kind of City are not the club for you. And I'm sure there's elements of that really within all of them. But when you see a Pep and Klopp as well, like on the other side, you can see that they have intense emotional relationships. Really with the footballers that they manage. You see them at the end of the game kind of hugging. You see them intensely just kind of speaking with each other. So there's a fascinating, I would say it's respect-based emotional relationship there that's generated in that they genuinely feel, I think, that that the managers have the best interests of the players at heart in terms of them being improved as footballers.
I could talk on this all day long. I'm mindful of wanting to bring us back to where this line of inquiry has taken you the last couple of years. This was a paper released in 2021, and I know this is a paper that has continued to spark more questions, more lines of research. I mean, coming back to you, Charlie, following this paper, what have you all been working on?
Well, it's funny you should say that, because we have fairly recently had another paper published. It's really concerned with sustainability. So the title is Sustaining the Unsustainable. And that paper is directly linked to the conversations that we're having now. So it's not an empirical presentation like the following paper. It's actually more of a discussion. And in that discussion, we essentially address the question of why coach. That's kind of where the inspiration comes from more generally. And it came out of the conversations that we're having now, very much in terms of the analysis process that we were going through. We'd have the transcripts in front of us. We'd be talking about what do we find in this data? How did this link to some other extracts that we had, some of the other participants, when we were kind of layering that together, and we were layering our own experiences from the empirical part of the project, the actual interviews, and perhaps some of the survey data as well. We then were kind of stemming off into these conversations around, well, why would we do this? And we're all in agreement, well, we absolutely love it, which was kind of, again, reflective of the findings of the paper, but reflective of this kind of sense of sustainability. And so within that paper, we pose that question, and we try and provide some kind of insights around how it links to this particular data set. But then, some of the ways in which we might then start to think about, again, making things that sound rather unsustainable a little bit more sustainable. And the central premise of the paper, it actually links to conversations we've had, the interrelation between individual and structure, thinking about how actions on the ground have an influence into organizations, how organizational changes start to have an influence on what's on the ground, and really trying to think through how can individuals start to make sense of what it is that they do and start to have an influence on it. And specifically in the paper, we also talk about authenticity. Not authenticity in this sense of like self being, who you're supposed to be, but an authenticity to being aware of the relations that are around you. This like being sharp to the relations that are around you. And again, that kind of links to this sense of sustainability. Well, who's influencing you? Who are you having an influence on? What are the consequences of this, short term, long term? How do I kind of have influence over key individuals or key members within the organization? And again, a sharpness to relations, an authentic way of talking about, thinking about the practice that's actually unfolding, again, which speaks to some kind of sustainability. Again, not this like, again, not an inauthentic sustainability, but a sharpness to relations sustainability. So we've got a couple of kind of premises from there as well.
So is that kind of, are you calling therefore for coaches to take more of a helicopter viewpoint of their own coaching self, to come away, to broaden their lens, to come away from that narrow lens of, let's say, the X's and the O's, almost to come away from themselves, when we're thinking about our why, and we're sharpening our sense of our relationship with others and maybe what others bring to us. You're asking coaches to become more well aware of self, and ask themselves the bigger pictures about why I do what I do, as well as broadening their lens onto what others bring to them and the advantages and benefits of those, in order to create more sustainability within their coaching practice.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I think one thing that I'd kind of stress off of what you've just said, though, is the appreciation of self in the way that we're talking about it, is how self is not something that is self-contained. It's not your choice to be the self. You're shaped by others. It's an outside-in process here,
Okay.
and therefore having a sharpness of your relations to what is shaping you and how you are shaping others then can speak to some of these more general questions around why are you doing what you're doing, where do you genuinely get a sense of satisfaction from in terms of your practice? Where are the points in which you're becoming vexed, frustrated with your practice, and how does that then consequently shape your understanding of why you're doing what you're doing? And as a result of that, hopefully have a more sensitivity to the influence that you can or cannot garner, and how you might be able to shape others' practice and your own practice, and becoming more contextually sensitive to your coaching, which also comes back to some of the previous points we mentioned around, well, what is it that you're actually doing when you're coaching? X's and O's of what you've mentioned are, they're fascinating. I love X's and O's. It's brilliant. I love thinking about shapes and formations, but it's not what I'm doing when I'm coaching. It's just a part of the consequence of what I'm doing. Really, I'm talking about getting people to link with each other, getting people to interact with each other on the pitch, start to manage some of that, give them ideas, get them to develop. And there's a technical, tactical part to that, but there's a social, emotional element that I need to try and have a grip on to think about what it is that I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And we try and make the link in the paper around how that speaks to a sustainability of practice. And it's not to get rid of, it's kind of where we started. It's not to get rid of these kind of the ambivalence of the coaching. There are going to be highs and lows. We can't get rid of this. And you can't have just simplistic solutions to really complex problems like the uncertainty and precarity of coaching. But it's becoming more sensitive to it is the argument that we make, that would hopefully lead to more sustainable people who understand where they fit into organizations, and hopefully then start to shift away from perhaps some of these greedy institutional practices that we've highlighted in this Contending vulnerability paper as well.
Dan, I think as Charlie's mentioned there, we need to get away from these simplistic solutions to these ideas, because we know it's social, emotional, it's relational, it's very core. I think some of the points you raised earlier about the structures, we can certainly have influences those spaces, but in the findings, the very first one around the busyness of the job, we talk about breadth and possibilities. So in some of the less well-resourced clubs, often then it might have been the women's football clubs. Perhaps the money wasn't there, the infrastructure wasn't there, they didn't have people doing analysis in some of the clubs we spoke to. And likewise in some of the men's game lower down. So those coaches then were doing the breadth of the work, the volume of the jobs they had was a lot. So in perhaps better resource clubs, of course, then you've got more people to work with. But the challenge here then was, well, they now need to work with more people. They need to network more, communicate more. So suddenly the possibilities meant there was even more work to do. So the structures are certainly a potential solution, but there also then becomes more dilemmas and tensions with those that you then have to work through. And essentially then just reinforces the point around the social, the relational nature of the work that we do.
I'd love to let Professor Robyn Jones close our conversation out here, please, sir.
It's never ending, Dan. That's an oxymoron to close the conversation on coaching. It's impossible. But I think what I'd just like to say is that everything that we've spoken about is not to change the nature of sport or coaching, because in the article that Charlie just mentioned, that one of the reasons why we coach, and we explored this, just kind of sitting down and just exploring our experiences, was something that kind of sport kind of philosophers call the sweet anxiety. And possibilities. I know Andy mentioned that word as well. The possibilities, I guess the hope that you have. So you don't want to get rid of that, because this is one of the reasons why we coach. I started thinking it really as an addiction, because it's so hard to get away from. Maybe it's a compulsion more than an addiction, but it's certainly there. So all this, everything that we've spoken about and that we write about, it does happen within a performance viewpoint of the world, a paradigm of performance. So we're not trying to alter that, because we genuinely think that more understanding, more in-depth insights, understanding about this stuff can actually improve the performances of athletes and of coaches and coaching itself. And Charlie mentioned something about the just whatness. Just what are we trying to do when we coach here? What And usually, if you really think through that question, it comes to something about the learning of others, so they can you demonstrate it. It can't be verbalized. I suppose it helps, but the evidence comes in the demonstration and the justification of the demonstration, maybe. So there's a marriage there. But it is within a performance viewpoint of the world. We're not trying to alter that, because we would never want to lose that kind of sweet anxiety and tension.
Absolutely fascinating, and I could talk to the three of you all day long, but I do want to be respectful of your time, and I'd be keen to have all three of you back on again as a follow-up conversation as your research evolves. But to close things out, let's come to you first, Charlie. How can people find you, follow you, find this paper or series of papers?
Yeah, good question. I have a Twitter page at Charlie Corsby. Really simple. Where I do generally tweet links. I'm not particularly active, but I will tweet like local papers. My DMs are always open, so I'm more than happy to share and talk about some of this work. We also have a sport coaching research hub, X page, I should call it, rather than Twitter. And again, for kind of the work that comes out of Cardiff Met as a coaching, a place of coaching research, a lot of our research will get published from there. And then general website page from Cardiff Met as well, which is frequently updated.
And Dr. Andy Lane, I mean, you're at Cardiff as well, so I'm sure all of that information was relevant in terms of finding your work, but can people find you and follow you online at all?
Yeah, they can do. I don't really use social media too much. So I guess the best way probably contact me, just send me an email, alane@cardiffmet.ac.uk. And yeah, if you've got questions about this paper or any other projects, I think the paper we've spoken about today is open access on the Sports Coaching Review. So people could Google that and then obviously get access to that paper.
And finally, Professor Robyn Jones. I'm unsure if you want to be found or followed, but and I'm not unsure if whether you use social media at all. But if you do, you're going to have a wealth of research for people to read. So, are there any channels in terms of people can find you and follow you?
Just like Andy, I suppose. Email me, but it's just to say that we take a stance here at Cardiff Met. We don't think it's a narrow one, but we do have a stance about coaching and and the nature of coaching. And allied to that, the vast majority of what we discuss actually ends up in written material. We actually write what we say, and we do our best to actually live our words in that respect. So it's all out there already.
Brilliant. Gents, I can't thank you enough. Thank you for your time.
And thank you very much, Dan. Enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dan.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that episode, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via X or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. I'd be delighted to hear any suggestions that you have. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.